Perfect. All right. Sorry about that. Sorry about all the technical difficulties. So today we're going to be talking about security standards in the Ethereum space. There are a lot of them, and at the same time there are only very few of them. And you'll kind of see what I mean as we go through it, but I think it'll be quite evident as to the adoption of standards in this space. At the same time, standards, security standards especially, are very, very prevalent in the general tech space, in the enterprise space, and there's a lot we could learn from. One of the problems with that is that it's a very broad subject, and so talking about it could take hours and hours and hours. So today I decided to focus just on the smart contract aspect of things, and specifically on the code of the smart contract, pretty much kind of like the meat and bones of it, the operations around smart contracts, and communications around it, which is something that's forgotten quite often, but it's very, very important. As far as I go, I am an auditor and a researcher at Consensus Diligence, as I was introduced, and I've been doing this stuff for 4 years professionally now in the Ethereum space, and then I've been in enterprise tech for highly regulated and litigated industries, specifically the big banks and big pharma, with very regulated, heavily regulated technologies like their communication stacks, which was very boring, but very useful, specifically for this talk, in fact. So, let's get started. To wake everybody up, I'm starting with a little bit of a funnier joke as things go in presentations, and that is, of course, the state of standards across any technology in the world. And that is, I'll give you a few seconds to look over it, but the story goes, of course, is there is a million standards for everything. An engineer comes and says, that's way too many, there should be one that unifies them all, and then creates yet another standard, and now it's 1,000,001. Unsurprisingly, that is, of course, the case in the Ethereum space. We'll see it most prevalent in the interface part of the space, but again, we'll see it in just a second. As far as the agenda of today's talk, it's going to be quite focused because sadly this is quite a dense topic, but I'll try to kind of pinpoint the big takeaways for us all as we talk about these standards and what worked in this space with actually very concrete examples about projects that I've worked with and you may have used as well. So first we're just going to define standards, what the heck they are, what they are going to be about, what people mean when they say standards in our space, and then of course we'll go through how they help us build products, operate them, and communicate about them. So, what makes a standard? Typically, standards is something that can be separated kind of in 3 different categories, or maybe they're all one category, which is just 3 different descriptions. But very, very typically, standards is something that is given by an authority figure or by legal right, and that's something that can be described as a de jure standard, right? So it's something like government tells you such and such thing is a standard, and now you have to comply with it. It's not super applicable to the Ethereum space because we're, of course, quite decentralized in that regard, and we don't really have an authority figure or an authority body. Now, another big definition for a standard is something that is very, very technical. It's very specific. It is something that answers to specific tests, something that qualifies for specific claims. And that's like your technical specification standard. Very popular in our space, very popular in the technology space in general. And then, of course, a standard, which is also very popular in our space, is something that is a best practice. That is very, very, very common to be used, very popular. May not be something that's formalized, but it's certainly something that is standard as far as usage goes in the space. And again, we'll see a lot of that in Ethereum. The very important part about standards, and this is something that's going to be kind of like the big takeaway, in my opinion, from my talk, is that it's not something that you get for a certification. It's not something that you get as a badge or a patch from an auditor such as myself. It is something that will legitimately improve your organization through policies and processes. It's boring, but it's actually very, very important. And frankly, security should be boring. And that is exactly why the most secure institutions of our time are very, very boring and have a lot of processes in them. It's because they have a lot of standards, checks, and balances that kind of help with that. And that's what they're there for, not for certification or a piece of paper. So speaking about Ethereum, why is it that standards kind of like should be a big deal in the space, kind of are a big deal in some senses, and why is it that I even made this presentation? Well, that is because, of course, it's kind of a perfect fit for standards. The technology itself is something that praises decentralization, and we like to believe, I believe that myself, is a decentralized technology in itself. Ethereum smart contracts are accessible by everyone and anyone. They're managed by everyone and anyone. And to kind of do that properly, to do that efficiently, you need to have some sort of a standard to kind of understand how to operate these things, how to build these things so that other people can kind of, well, cooperate with it. Very luckily, in our neck of the woods, in Ethereum, I will say a very spicy take is that this is not the case for a lot of other cryptocurrency ecosystems. And that is in Ethereum, there is a very rich culture of open source collaboration. A lot of other projects deploy their contracts and they don't even verify them. They don't even have their own GitHub available for you, which is really, frankly, a shame. And in the Ethereum space, this is a cardinal sin, right? If you do anything in the space, it's got to be open source, especially if we're talking about smart contracts. This is very much welcome. And what's also welcome is the kind of the corollary of that open source is that there's a lot of collaboration. People use each other's stuff very much. They fork each other's stuff. They change it, and they collaborate and they build up on each other. Again, to do this effectively, you need to have a standard around these things. And finally, and this is most important, and I think we're finally realizing it in the last few years, Ethereum is mission-critical infrastructure. This is a financial world. This is new financial rails for the world. This is not a joke. This is not apes and monkeys, frogs, and we're going to make it. This is people's life savings. I think FTX was a big wake-up call where a lot of people, like it was shilled to everyone, and a lot of people used it. And although it was Web 2 technology, it was still very much crypto-related, and it blew up, and lots of people lost their life savings when it was touted as one of the most secure and safe things. And well, finance is very important. And this is something that we need to take very seriously, and is mission critical as far as people's literally sometimes food on the table goes. So we need to take it seriously, and for that we do need to do the boring thing. We do need to check through all the checks and balances, standards and whatnot, the lists. So it's a perfect fit, the Ethereum technology for the standards space. With the one caveat, of course, that I mentioned, there is no official body of certification, of authority as far as standards go, and that kind of makes things a little bit difficult as far as coordination goes, of course, especially in something like standards, but we'll see how that works out for us. So in preparation for this talk, I made the awful decision to go through a lot of enterprise standards and technical specifications, a lot, maybe all, frankly, standards in the Ethereum space, and kind of like the best practices for it. And then I evaluated them all. We'll go through that fairly quickly, and then we'll dive into a little bit more detail. This is how I evaluated them. I mean, this is very, very simple. It's just basically like, what's the standard? Does it affect code, process, or communications? And then, is it a general standard from the tech space, or is it something that is crypto native, i.e. Ethereum native, like we made it within our space for ourselves? So starting with the enterprise world, there are a lot of standards. I mean, way more than that. But I've kind of picked out a few of the big ones that are actually applicable specifically to smart contracts. And this is what I got, or at least this is what I've read through for our talk today. A couple of them, such as the very first one, ISO 27001, is a very general standard. It's an information security standard. but it is actually critical for us today in the Ethereum space to take very seriously. We'll kind of see why. Although it doesn't affect code, I mean, if anybody here is building a company, building smart contract protocol, or is in the security space, helping do that, or even if you're a vendor like me, you got to know it. I mean, you have to. It'll become evident why. Outside of these general ones, there are actually quite a few very specific standards to smart contracts in our space. This is surprising, at least to me, and I think to a lot of people in this space, because the enterprise world actually knows a lot about us. It knows very, very, very clearly what a smart contract is, what it isn't, what a DLT is, what a blockchain is, what a consensus is. And let me tell you, these smart contract standards from the enterprise world, such as ISO 23257 and NIST IR 8202, they legitimately talk about token incentives and governance. I mean, I know protocols that are crypto natives that don't have that don't really talk about how their token incentives are structured and if that's effective or not. And this is very, very much discussed in the security aspect of things in these standards, which is very nice to see in the sense of the adoption of technology, but a bit frightening to see from a crypto native perspective because, in my opinion, I've always thought, we're ahead of the game and we know this stuff and they kind of don't. They very much know it. They very much understand our technology quite as well as we do. And then they understand quite a bit more that we don't. And what I mean by that is, nope, that was too far. Standards in the Ethereum space is something that is very heavily focused on code, with the exception of one that I wanted to kind of point out, this one over here. That's pretty much all we care about, really, guys. This is what we do. This is what we like. We're very technical people. We hate people. We hate trust. We like tech, we like code, we like tests, we like bytecode, we like API, and in fact, that's what most of the standards talk about 90% of the time. It is how to build the product, how to build the code, how to very explicitly have your functions defined, sometimes down to the compiler level within the standard, not even just technology or, the language itself. It is very welcome to see, though, that there's a couple of standards now that, such as the EEA ones and the CCSS, that are now talking about processes as well. It's not something that's super very well adopted, but it is nice to see that processes are starting to break into the crypto world as well as far as standards go. But something that really isn't, even though it kind of looks like it's not so bad, is the communications part of standards. That is really, really lacking, and again, we'll kind of talk about it. You'll see what I mean. In the reality of things, very sadly, standards are standards, but they're not actually adopted. What's adopted is best practices. And I mean, I kind of just threw this up there. I mean, this is all true. We can probably all talk about each one of these for an hour. But what's actually adopted is not a standard for contracts outside of the ERC world. It's the contract best practices, the token best practices, the role of best practices. And very, very few of them, of these best practices, actually talk about how to manage these things in the sense of a kind of formalized standard within the industry. They just talk about what it is that you deploy, and then you have to figure it out on your own. This isn't to say, and I'll repeat this later, this isn't to say that people don't have processes around these things. It's that there are no formalized processes around these things that are shared amongst the industry as a popular standard. Yeah, so again, to kind of wake us all up, what's the state of the standards world in the Ethereum space is that they exist. They're quite, I wouldn't say a lot of them, but there are a few of them. They're known, but like nobody uses them, or very few people use them. Instead, what people use is their know-how and their do-it-yourself type of an approach for that. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from it. That doesn't mean that we can't push it. And for us to kind of get there, I've come up with a couple of big successes from the standards that I've read that could be applicable to our world, and some of the best practices that are shared within the big projects. So, as promised, let's start with the code aspect of things.
which is how do standards affect building smart contract code. Again, starting from the enterprise world, I'll mention a couple of standards over here, which is the ISO 23257 and NIST SP 800-208. The reason I'm just going to be very quick here, the reason I want to point them out is that it's not because we can learn from it, because again, we know this better, or we thought better than anyone, but that they know it too. By they, I mean the enterprise world, I mean the incumbents, I mean the big banks, the big tech. They know very well what a smart contract is, what a function is, what Ethereum is, what Bitcoin is, what a very niche consensus mechanism is. They really, really do know it. One thing that they do that we also do, but they really focus more than us, is that they do it on a much more academic level, kind of like the math functions of it, the hash functions of it, as opposed to like actual code and engineering, although they do have it, of course. So standards that are out there right now in the enterprise world definitely do define and help people actually come up with smart contract code. In the Ethereum world, we actually do have, of course, standards that really define what your code should look like. I really want to give a big shout out, and I'm going to be doing that a little bit throughout this presentation, to the EAA people. Specifically, their standards for ETH trust security levels is very impressive. It defines on a very explicit level what your code should look like, what it should answer to, what it should test to, how it should be tested, and all things of that manner. It's very, very nice. I heavily recommend everybody to kind of go over it. And I don't just say this because I was a contributor to it, but because it's actually quite powerful. They have a couple other standards. Specifically, one I really want to point out is the DeFi risk assessment guidelines, because this one is much less about code, although there is some code guidelines there. It's more about processes, but we'll look over it as well. And one more I wanted to mention, although it's actually sadly not maintained anymore, is the SWC registry, Smart Contract Weakness Classification Registry, and the OWASP Smart Contract Top 10. I mean, that's a very, very small standard. In fact, OWASP is, of course, giant, but the Smart Contract Top 10 is very, very small. But I just wanted to give a shout out to, I think it's only a couple of people that made it, maybe over a hackathon, but it was kind of nice. Long story short, super code heavy, vulnerability heavy, kind of interesting. Again, something that we all know, but it's nice to see people come up with it. And of course, naturally, the ERC standards that we all know and love, like ERC20 tokens or ERC721 and stuff like that. And in fact, the ERC tokens are, the ERC, standards are something that's a very good example of the standards in the Ethereum space. And that is because, of course, we have so many of them. There is so many standards. I mean, how many of them are used? Not that many. There's a couple of big ones. I'm not saying we shouldn't come up with more, we should. And in fact, these are the ones that are accepted, so to speak. There's a bunch that are under last call on the EIP website, and there's a bajillion more, like an unfathomable amount more that are either deprecated or under review or whatever. And again, these are ERCs, these are not EIPs, this is not hard fork, soft fork, none of that. These are actually standards for just writing smart contracts on the Ethereum Foundation website. We love coming up with standards. We love taking a standard, just tweaking it just slightly and making it your own. Doesn't really help with adoption, sadly. It would be much better if we kind of more formalize around a couple of standards, as we have around ERC20, but this culture of I'll take it, tweak it a little bit, make it my own, is definitely very prevalent in our space, which is good and bad at the same time. But again, as I mentioned, standards are standards, but the reality is that people don't use standards in our space, they use best practices, and they do it by doing their own thing. The real standard is don't follow other people's standards, is take it and kind of change it a little bit. And people even go as far as to, because of course our technology allows it to, is take a deployed technology and use that directly, such as a deployed smart contract. But if you're going to change it, you don't just change it and use the same standard. You change it, change the standard, and then change the technology as well, or change the smart contract. It is what it is. But as far as other best practices go, that of course they made it into the actual standards like EEA I mentioned before, but some big ones that again, I'm sure everybody here knows, but are so important, I would like to mention them again, is use audited libraries, like of course our folks at Open Zeppelin, use things like role-based access control, very, very important, especially for processes as I'll mention later. Have upgradable contracts. I know this is a bit of a hot take around some purists, but the reality is the reality that you'll find bugs and you need to fix them. Use modular patterns. This is something I see so many newcomers fail to do, is create giant smart contracts as opposed to make a very small smart contract. And then they complain about how it's so hard to audit and certify it because, of course, certifying a 1,500 line of code smart contract is much harder than a 300 line smart contract. But the most impactful ones are the 300 line smart contracts. And of course, invariant-driven development, something that's been a trend in the last couple of years in the industry, is a very nice best practice that I keep seeing around a lot of my clients and the projects that I work with and use, of course. So kind of the big takeaway here as far as standards and code goes is that we love code specs. We love to be technical. We love creating them, modifying them, making them your own, but we don't like following them. If there is a popular one, the general gist is maybe I can do it better and then you change it instead of just following it directly. It is what it is, which is kind of ironic because while we do that with standards, we still use other people's technology and we fork it and their patterns. So it's kind of an interesting spot that we're in as far as standards go. Somehow we don't like to be constrained that much. Now, there's a couple of other things I really want to say, and I kind of have to hurry up, I think. And that is, of course, the smart contract operations part of things is something that is becoming much more important over the last couple of years in our space. So again, this is something that the enterprise world knows by heart. It's super boring. Standards and operations are something they live and breathe. And it boils down to, I mean, I'm not going to go through it all, because it's a lot, but it really boils down to change request of a change request, an audit log of an audit log, recording everything, documenting everything, knowing where everybody stands, getting a sign-off for all these things. And it sounds awful, it sounds super slow, but it is necessary. Again, kind of a scary thing, or was a scary thing for me to realize, is that they have very much understood the importance of that in the Ethereum and the cryptocurrency smart contract space. And the standards outside of the super general ones like the 2701, the other standards that I mentioned that are about smart contracts, they explicitly talk about very, very crypto native things in the kind of through the lenses of proper processes. So they do talk about key management techniques and procedures as far as like proper processes go. They do talk about literally token incentives and how they can modify your security posture and how you should think about it properly and what are the processes there. And the big thing that we hate, but it is very much a big part of all these standards, is that the human element is the major risk factor indeed. And it is why the processes are there, to try and address that part. Heavily recommend anybody to look over these. A big thing that is touted in the enterprise space is the secure software development lifecycle. And it is something that, frankly, you're required to do if you are developing in that space. And again, now it's coming to our space. And that is, it's not just, you don't just YOLO your contract and you write it. And you don't even just write it, POC it, test it, and then get it for review. You get that review when you start the POC. You get that review when you just start writing the contract. In fact, what you do is you have a whole suite of tools for your code as you're just starting to write the contract. That's things like fuzzing, of course. That's things like even just like some unit test software in the beginning of the development. That's things like monitoring the blockchain and transactions when you actually deploy the contracts into production. As far as our space standards go, again, big shout out to the EEA people. They have done a very, very good job of trying to actually map the enterprise processes onto our world and emphasizing some of the things that work there. And again, unsurprisingly, one of the biggest things they emphasize is tools. Tooling is a giant part of security standards and getting things secure, getting things done right. But one of the other things that they really very much emphasize too is things like information security, hardening, and just the general standards for InfoSec that we don't really follow, or maybe the major companies do, but frankly, really not everyone, as is evident by some of the latest operational hacks. Speaking of, I really want to give a shout out to the CCSS people, which is cryptoconsortium.org, and CCSS stands for literally Cryptocurrency Security Standards. It focuses pretty much on one thing. There's a couple other things, but key management. Key management is not in a great state in our industry right now. From like where your keys are, because again, we're remote, to their access, geographical implications of that, clearing your keys, rotating your keys. It's separating of keys for your cold and hot and colder wallets. It's not in a great state, but it's kind of getting there. Best practices for operations is something, again, as I mentioned, it's something that's not quite standardized, but it is used across. And it is nice to see that in our world today, again, while we don't quite qualify for standards with a lot of these companies, what we do is they do pick up a couple of big processes there, which is, of course, the tooling that I mentioned. There's a lot of very complex tooling for like fuzzing, formal verification, and all that type of stuff, of course, audits as well. And then some of the things for when things go wrong, there's more and more best practices around things like seal. But for a general part, you do your own thing. Again, this doesn't mean that they don't do anything at all. It just means that what they do is kind of like not really shared across. I think I'm coming up on time, so I'll have to hurry up a little bit, very sadly. A thing that I would like to mention is a couple of big successes. I'll just run through that, and then the rest of the stuff you can see online. So a big one that, for example, my team does is fuzzing. We do fuzzing for MoonMath, frankly, for ZK. And it's now starting to pick up across several teams because, of course, the more complex the technology, the more applicable things like checks and balances are. And we fuzz a lot of different technologies across the ZK stacks. And for example, Linea, we have found several $1 million bugs there, and you can see that quite well. A big one that I want to give a shout out to is Euler with their processes around, well, frankly, anything, but the big one I want to point out is their post-mortem processes, because they were able to recover several hundreds millions worth of dollars by focusing on the human link and aspect of things in the exploit kind of recovery part of it. Very, very important to follow the proper policies and processes for that, and that's why they were able to do that. So smart contract operations is the next growing pain point. Get ahead of it. Again, I'm out of time, sadly. I'll have to run through a couple of things. Communication is super important. Enterprise world definitely understands that. Very quickly, what does it mean? That means having the right channel set up, having things documenting, and notifying the right people. Again, the EEA people have done a great job actually pointing that out. There's a whole section that says this can help with against all kinds of risk. Very true. Communications, proper communications build trust, and trust builds security. We suck at that in the reality of things. You will be lucky to see GitHub and Twitter on a project, maybe docs, but probably they're unmaintained, and that's something that you can see a lot in our industry is its big immaturity. A couple of big shout outs I would like to give to is some companies like Lido, which have really impeccable security communications for things like their upgrades. Every single vote that their token holders do is provided with a guide on how to actually check the vote with several scripts through an open source manner and verify them. Very impressive. Wish this will become a standard in our space. It's not. Another thing we'd like to give a shout out to is things like security charters. So for security councils, not something That's everywhere, but it's coming up more and more. Again, it's very important to tell people what your security council actually does, what it's meant to do, their responsibilities. And that's something that's becoming bigger. Not quite a standard. I wish it will be. Communications are super duper important. We suck at it the most right now. And it definitely affects us as far as hacks go and recovery of funds. So one last thing I want to mention too, this is literally my last 2 slides, is that all of this stuff is super duper boring. I understand, but security is, and it's meant to be kind of boring for things like critical information, critical infrastructure. And look, we are not very good at it. We are not very good at the operation side of things and the communication side of things. This is not even an updated slide. This is a slide from Pablo Sabatella from Bangkok, and it's not updated with the Bybit $1.5 billion hack, or 1.3, I don't quite remember. That was a fully an operations hack. Our hacks in the last couple of years are not because of smart contract code, which is great. Our code is now secure. It is because we do stupid stuff and we forget to follow policies and we forget about separation of privileges. And it's very, very, very important. That's about it. Thank you very much. So one last thing. Okay. Just, if we don't get our stuff together, the incumbents will come and do it better. Because if we can stomach $1.3 billion worth of losses for a big company, they can stomach it even better, and they can go through it much better. So if we don't, they will, and it better be not goddamn big banks that take over our space. Thank you.